I spent my childhood, licking NDPA stamps, going down to the black belt with my parents. My parents are also, my mother took me to, when I was 4 months old, to a sit-in and got herself arrested, as part of the publicity stunt to desegregate public accommodation. So that was the life I grew up in. The other creed, I mean, both of my parents were extraordinarily educated. Uh, and the other creed was this idea of academic excellence. So that was my childhood, and that's what I wrote about in The Agitator's Daughter. Thank you for asking.
And since then, you've been a prolific writer and scholar on the topic of racial inequality. You have a new book coming out, I believe next year, you said. It's called White Space, Blackhood, Opportunity Hoarding, and Segregation in the Age of Inequality. And it focuses on American anti-Black oppression and the way it ensnares citizens and nations and illuminates the 21st century residential caste system. What led you to focus on topics like this and this topic, and why do you think that's important?
So I'm a reluctant academic. I like I said, I come from the civil rights family. And so for me, I'm conflicted about the luxury of being in the academy where I get to write. I'm not out in the streets. And after I received tenure, I, I felt that the all of this work I was doing, I was very much, I've been obsessed with American segregation, residential segregation particularly, and I had been working on those issues in the White House. And I just felt like it was my obligation to speak to a broader audience than the academy. And so, this is my fifth book. I've written a series of books, but all of them are about some aspect of American race relations, some aspect of why it is, the structures that have been constructed out of white supremacy, and what we can do to create a saner politics to confront those structures, abolish them, and repair the damage of these structures. So this book, which is, I've been writing it for 3 years, but I've also been writing it for 20 years. It builds on my first book, The Failures of Integration. And I'm basically saying that we have a caste system in this country. It's no longer based solely on race. It's at the intersection of race, poverty, and geography where you live. What we've done through federal, state, and local policy is to create communities of abundance, heavily white, and communities of need, heavily Black and brown. And we overinvest in white space, and we disinvest in Black space, but we continue to contain and reify concentrated poverty. And we tell tales about the people who live in concentrated poverty to justify and mask the way things are. The way things are is that we actually overinvest and cross subsidize affluent areas. And so I shine a light on all of it. Three main processes of anti-Black residential caste: boundary maintenance, maintaining boundaries both in schools and in neighborhoods that keep people apart. Surveillance, surveilling people, particularly Black bodies, wherever they're found, but particularly in Black neighborhoods, and opportunity hoarding. This country spends about $23 billion more annually in majority white school districts than they do in majority minority schools for the same amount of children, $23 billion. So we have a separate and unequal nation, and we don't own up to it.
Professor Cashin, based on your research, is there one American city that exemplifies this segregation that you refer to, that is the systemic processes that has endured for a century?
Well, there's several. I opened my book with Baltimore, in part because living in Washington D.C. It was easier. It's more familiar to me. I know people there. I could get over there. I could do interviews, but um, in the mid 20th century, there were as many as 50 cities that were hyper segregated. That's a term that's associated with Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton's iconic book, American Apartheid. Um, we're down to only 21 cities that are hyper segregated. But wherever Black American migrants, the great migrants landed, something, millions of Black people left the Jim Crow South and went north and west. Wherever they landed in large numbers, the primary response of federal, state, and local policy to large numbers of Black people was to contain them in certain neighborhoods, and to redline the neighborhoods where they were, to disinvest there, and create a separate and an equal landscape. And Baltimore is an iconic example of that. If you look at a map of Baltimore, particularly a racially coded map, you'll see that it's referred to colloquially, as the black butterfly and the white L. East and West Baltimore are heavily Black, and down through the middle of Baltimore, there's a heavily white space. A lot of Asians also live in that space. And there's been racial equity analysis that despite Black people being politically in charge for decades, the city puts about 4 times as much money into majority white space than it does in Black space. Now, the new mayor, Brandon Scott, I believe his name is, he has been on a mission to disrupt that, and they've passed 2 important laws that require an equity analysis going forward and looks carefully at how money is spent, and they're trying to disrupt these processes. But Baltimore is an iconic example.
That's really interesting, and it's really interesting in your books, and I'm sure this one's no different, that you really do take this detailed look at history to use it to shine a light on current damage and current issues. Why do you do that? Like, why is it important for people to understand kind of the history of our country in order to really understand these current issues?
Some of it may be that I'm a history buff, but more of it is that you cannot understand how we got here without understanding the history. And one of my main arguments in this current book, White Space, Blackhood, is that intentional public policy choices made 100 years ago in the 20s and 30s, 40s, to create Black neighborhoods, Black ghettos, intentional public policies created this space. If you looked at what cities looked like in the 1910s, 1900, 1910s, in Baltimore included, you could find Black people living, they might have been clustered in their own blocks, but they were actually fairly evenly distributed across the city. Black people could go into the stores, try on the clothes, try on the hats, right? Baltimore and other places, Baltimore actually was the originator of racial zoning, right? They got upset, some of the city leaders got upset that some high income Black people chose to buy homes near white elites, and they started, and then the whole ideas about Jim Crow were starting to rage in the South, right? But the federal government, I mean, and Baltimore and local places chose to try racial zoning. That when the Supreme Court said they couldn't do that in Buchanan versus Worley in 1917, then the federal government taught people how to redline and encouraged them to use racially restrictive covenants. With the homeowners lending, the federal government created the 30-year mortgage to bring home ownership to the white masses, and said we won't underwrite neighborhoods that are risky. That basically, they would only underwrite majority white neighborhoods, cutting Black people out of the largest wealth building program sponsored by the federal government. The federal government chose to fund public housing administered intentionally by localities on a racial basis. They acquiesced in localities creating Black projects for Black people in certain neighborhoods and white projects for white people elsewhere. And if you insist that 100% of everybody in the building be poor, what happens? Instantly, you get concentrated Black poverty, right? And the federal government paid for that, sponsored that. They constructed that, right? The federal government sponsored the Interstate Highway Program, right? The largest public works program in the history of the world when it was first built, and acquiesced in the local highway engineers intentionally using federal money to mow down vital Black neighborhoods and create a firewall between the Black side of town and the white side of town, right? The federal government did these things for years. HUD got sued for years. HUD was the main culprit in sponsoring and encouraging segregation. And if you don't know this history, you can have the illusion that if you won the parent lottery and got to grow up in poverty-free space, that everything you got was earned, right? Your golden schools with excellent teachers and low poverty is, and your, whatever you got from that is earned 100% by your individual effort, right? And so it helps to disrupt these false narratives that people tell about people who live elsewhere.
Yeah, Minnesotans who are listening to this later or watching this may be able to relate to the specific state-sponsored destruction of active Black communities that you're talking about, because St. Paul's Rondo neighborhood used to be the center of Black community in the Twin Cities in the 20th century. It was a viable working class community supported by social clubs, religious organizations, and community center. And it was also a thriving business community. And that was demolished between 56 and 68 to make way for the now I-94 freeway that connects the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul. It's very interesting. You referred to this situation as an American caste system. Just last week, I completed reading Pulitzer Prize winner Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Caste, that does an amazing job of comparing the 1,000-year-old caste system in India, compares it to the 1930s fascism in Europe, specifically looking at Nazism, and comparing it to the work of the white supremacists in the US. What do you think about this this adoption of the phrase American caste system? And you touched upon this a little bit, and then how does it communicate the systems that are prevalent in this country? How do you describe that?
Right. So, and I have not read Ms. Wilkerson's book yet. I intend to. It's on my list. I was reluctant to read it while I was finishing my book. I wanted to sort of keep my own theories straight in my head. But having said that, there's a field called social dominance theory, right? And basically what social dominance theory says is that every society creates hierarchies, and they tell origin stories to justify the hierarchies. And often these stories are created by elites, but they teach the public the stories and myths we tell to justify a hierarchy are often animating the adoption of laws that then construct structures, and the structures themselves, the institutions that get created around these ideas. The people who participate in those institutions and benefit from them participate in the ideology that animates them. Now, in the U.S., that white supremacy and the superiority of whites to blacks and others was part of the lore that was necessary to create slavery and its follow-on institutions, Jim Crow, peonage. I'm arguing that the concentrated Black poverty, the iconic Black ghetto, which I don't use as a pejorative. I just use that word to describe concentrated Black poverty, but that's a follow-on institution. It's a follow-on institution of containment, right? In India, which you would, I'm sure you could relate to this, right? When I gave a talk about this, I had an Indian person come up to me and said, she would tell me the stories that are told about people, lower caste people, right? In India, to justify them being lower down and treated differently, right? So there's and they can get very, very elaborate, as I understand it, the caste system in India and the different classes of categorizations of people in Brazil can get quite Byzantine, right? But people tell stories. So what I'm arguing is that we have a system of residential caste, and there's people, I'm not exactly sure. I haven't read her book. I know it's about social caste or whatever, but I'm talking about the core of structural racism in this country. At its core is physical segregation, and it is a mechanism for redistributing resources toward affluent people and away from low-income people, particularly low-income Black people. So, so it is a caste system, but it's not based solely on race. Like I said, it's based on it's an intersectional concept, right? Race, poverty, and geography. Some people get to escape. The good news about post-civil rights America is that, pre-civil rights America, almost all Black people, particularly in the South, were labeled as inferior and got inferior public goods based on their race. The Civil Rights Revolution was about disrupting that. And it is true that people, to be Black in this country doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be subjugated, although you can experience discrimination. But, most people most Black people don't live in concentrated Black poverty anymore, right? So, but the people who are trapped in concentrated Black poverty are much more likely to be contained there, and exit is very improbable. And that's what I'm exposing.
Yeah, how does this mythology, this ghetto mythology, the narrative that's distributed among especially wealthy white communities with power. How does this relate to white on Black surveillance and also kind of the BLM movement of today?
So what I argue is that well, there are two things going on. The ghetto myths, and the prominent example is Ronald Reagan and his welfare queen, which was a total fiction, right? You can read the book Welfare Queen. It was a total fiction. It was a performance by this woman, right? But he ran with that, and that was a big part of his political rhetoric that got him elected. Well, he ran on it in I think his first time in '76. But anyway, my point is, we've had a series of presidents participate in this, and other people participate in this political performance art, dog whistling, with these iconic anti-Black stereotypes: welfare queen, super predator, thug, and those stereotypes helped to propel some pretty nefarious policies and laws. All right, so there's that, but there's also the perceptions of Blackness that people carry in their head, right? The association of Blackness with criminality. People with no intimate knowledge or intimate experience with Black people often get their ideas about Blackness from crime stories or some of these stereotypes. So that, my sons who still look like children at 14, but it's gonna happen. They're getting taller, they're getting more muscular, they're getting facial hair, and at some point they're going to start noticing that people aren't smiling at them in the street anymore, that people who used to see them as cute are seeing them in a frightened way and crossing the street, things that my husband experiences, right? And where do people get these ideas? A lot of these negative perceptions of Black people are incubated in the hood, right? Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, talks about, all of the news stories, the false news stories, the hysterical news stories about crack that propelled a lot of these ridiculously punitive approaches to drug use, right? So anti-Blackness and the codes of anti-Blackness perform a political function. We saw it with President Trump this summer, tweeting about, tweeting to, and he didn't use a dog whistle, he used a bullhorn, tweeting to people, like trying to woo white suburbanites, casting himself as the protector from some kind of invasion. It was in his say, thank me for suspending the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, which was a federal law. I'd never seen this in post-civil rights America. The president of the United States actively promoting economic and racial segregation, which is contrary to the Fair Housing Act, right? A man who was desperate to distract people from his ineptness in handling a pandemic, is also tweeting about looters and all of this, right? It's an old, cynical game in this country, but that kind of politics and language and ideas is what leads us to nefarious, harmful policies. And the main message of my writing, in the current book that I'm about to drop, is that we need to change the lens by which we see people, particularly poor Black people, from presumed thug to presumed citizen. And when you free yourself up from those ideas those highly negative, nasty ideas. It frees you to focus on evidence-based policies that might be cheaper. It certainly are more humane. And I lift up some examples of that, right? Innovative approaches that have dramatically reduced crime and gotten results, dramatically reduced street violence and gotten results. I'm thinking about Richmond's peacemaker fellowships, in which they basically identified the 25 people who were most prone to gun violence and brought them in and gave them a fellowship and surrounded them with loving mentors who gave them access to cognitive behavioral therapy and internships and a GED and what supports they needed, and paid them for their expertise if they committed to being nonviolent. And they had a 50% reduction in violence for a fraction of the cost of policing, right? But if you wouldn't come to a policy like that if you have this lens well, you come to a policy like that when you have a lens of love and see a person as a potential asset rather than a predator.
Recently, especially post the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police, abolition is being talked about. It's talked about in multiple contexts, prisons and law enforcement. As a part of, you mentioned abolition as a part of the solution, especially in terms of the state sanctioned processes, the three things that you listed: boundary maintenance, opportunity hoarding, and surveillance. What are some of the positive examples of these solutions and what do investments look like?
So I just gave you one, which was the Office of Neighborhood Safety and the Peacemaker Fellowships that the city of Richmond, California created. It's become a model. There's a organization called Advance Peace. You can find their website. Something like 20 cities have followed the Richmond, California model of basically hiring former felons, people who are expert in the codes of the street, to be 24/7 mentors to young people and to anticipate and diffuse beefs that are happening in the street, to be proactive and to give and to love on young people in the most violence-torn neighborhoods, and help them connect to something else, right? And so that's one example. And there are about 20 cities in the US that have opened offices of neighborhood safety, which are independent of the police, right? Angela Davis said in her book, I believe her book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, that we need to build, abolition needs to include reparation or repair as well, right? That you need, it's not enough to negate existing institutions. You have to build up alternatives. And there she was talking about alternatives to carceral approaches, right? She also, in her book, Abolition Democracy, picked up on this phrase that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in Black Reconstruction. We need to create a robust abolition democracy, meaning we need to do the grassroots organizing and gathering of allies to get to 51% and win elections and elect people to positions that are willing to pursue saner, more humane, and more effective policies than just mass incarceration and massive militaristic style policing, right? So it's an exciting time in that there's sort of a new abolitionism, right? I'm a huge, like I adopted my father's hero, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is my hero. In fact, I have an original first edition book of the life and times of Frederick Douglass right here. Wow. it was in our den in our in our den. It was in our den. Anyway, I grew up with that book on the shelf, and it's one of my important inheritances. But my point is that abolitionism is 400 years long in this country, right? And the follow-on structures, the follow-on anti-Black institutions, we have them, and they need to be acknowledged, and we need to create a robust, caring, multiracial politics animated by what King said, agape love and universal human equality, to dismantle institutions born of supremacy and replace them with new institutions that are humane, caring, and connect all people to opportunity.
Yeah, and given all of this, given all this history that has been hidden to a lot of the population in the United States who don't know this history, they don't know this segregation. Do you have hope? Is there hope moving forward here?
Well, James Baldwin, here he is, another hero of mine. A quote from him, which I recently came across, is that hope, I think it's hope is created every day. I may not have it exactly right, but that's the gist of it. Hope is created every day. You have to choose hope. The forces of darkness in this country want you to be hopeless so that you'll just stay in bed and do nothing, right? But I have hope. This election actually made me feel better about this country. I'm a half full person, right? The half full glass had 80, maybe 81 million votes in it. 7 more million votes than the other side, right? There is a sense, and something where between 15 and 26 million people mounted protests in 2,500 localities in this country. New York Times said they believe it's the largest movement, social movement in the history of this country. Black people have allies, and they have more than they've ever had before. You had a Democratic presidential aspirant center racial equity and healing in his campaign rhetoric. I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen anything like it. If you read the Biden-Harris platform, they had an explicit platform about racial equity. I've never seen anything like it in the Democratic Party, right? Now, the coalition that voted him in has to hold him accountable, right? So these things give me hope. They do give me hope. And I'm old enough to, if it all falls apart, I could retire somewhere else, but I haven't given up on this country yet.
Well, that is encouraging. And how, this is a little transition here, but how is your family navigating the pandemic? How is your teaching and research and writing influenced by it?
Well, I'm the mother of twin 14-year-olds, and they're learning from home. I think we're doing okay. I've been teaching from home, teaching online. I'm sure, have you been online? Were you online this semester? It's exhausting. There's something about it. It's exhausting. By the end of the semester, I was exhausted. We're muddling through. We're all doing the best we can. Hopefully by the fall, I'll be back in the classroom, but we're just doing the best we can. It's tough. It's tough.
Yeah, all of us. I guess this is the final question. You served in the Clinton administration as an advisor on urban and economic policy, particularly concerning community development in inner city neighborhoods. can we expect to see Professor Cashin in the Biden administration? Is there any inside scoop that you could give us today?
No one's come asking me to work for them. And to be honest, I am a writer. That's my contribution. And I have a peace. I'm at peace with that. What I hope to do is to try to, I have a piece that I wrote in Politico, which was my take on what I thought should happen with the Biden administration. I was so pleased that my friend, Susan Rice, was named today as head of domestic policy council. And I will let my friends know who are in the administration what I think, and on the outside do what I can to hold them accountable. But I have a good sense of my purpose in life, and it's through my writing and my voice and advocacy that I make my contribution.
Well, thank you so much for taking close to an hour on a weekday and speaking with us. I'm speaking on behalf of the Journal of Law Inequality, University of Minnesota Law School, and of course, Marisa and myself. A huge thanks. This was an incredibly insightful conversation. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.